pretty much it was the competent persons were all blamed. Why did you allow this to happen? And that's alluding to agency theory. You're now working in a company, and the boss has said, this is what we've got, because the boss has went out to the press, and there's a whole load of stuff in the press, and it's like, we've got this project, it's 20 million tons at 5 grams per ton, and that's what's out in the public domain. And now you, as a competent person, now need to sort of try and find those tons and find a way to get that stuff, because that's what the boss has already said.
Mark Burnett is a consultant with AMC who has a deep interest and curiosity that I really connect with. He is a thinker and somehow has found a way to find the time amidst all the other things that he does to write papers and contribute to the industry and some of the more important topics of our day. Yes, again, we descend into the rabbit holes of regulation and codes and so on, but there's something new here. Both Mark and I are fascinated by the psychology of decisions and actions by our professionals. So finally, I have a chance to hear about the rationalization trap, cognitive dissonance, relative morality, fraud in the industry, and the teachings of history. Mark has some great references that I will list in the description of this video as well that should be mandatory reading for any professional busying themselves with self-regulation, overregulation, classification, market reporting, and so on. Hope you get something out of it. And now I bring you Mark Burnett.
Welcome, Mark. I think we're in it, but I'm really excited to have a chat. And I lied because I said I never prepare, but I did actually print off a few things. Not necessarily from a preparation perspective, but the last time we chatted about some of these things, I did want to go back to a couple of points, particularly on psychology, which is obviously not, as a geologist, my field of experience. So I did print off a couple of things, and not to provide any traps or anything, but just as a couple of hooks there to maybe get into, because I think we probably are reading similar things, and that can be exciting. But maybe just to start off, it's always nice to just know what your background is and what it is that you do for the readers. Obviously, we just talked about different things. For the listeners, the viewers, the watchers, those people, those 3.5 possums, just to know what your background is and what you're playing with at the moment, because you're doing a whole bunch of things there, outside normal work that are inspiring. So just maybe if you just humor me with a few minutes of background, that would be awesome.
Sure, and I like the way you slipped a Buffy the Vampire reference in there.
Yes, right.
Watch
well
it.
done.
What can I say?
That's also 90s, right? Yeah, well done.
Yeah, 90s and the librarian, so you can go with that.
Nice.
Well, geologist for my sins, what can I say? I work for AMC Consultants, so yes, one of those consulting type people that get their noses stuck into everything. So apart from my day-to-day consulting job and getting involved with that, I am involved with SEG. I'm the VP for Europe until the end of the year. I'm involved with CRIRSCO as PERC's rep in CRIRSCO. By default, I get roped into PERC as well. So on the executive for PERC, got roped into UNORMS, so I was in 3 of those expert working groups, and then get dragged into various other things. And because of that, I end up picking up weird and wonderful things and pursuing them down various rabbit holes to see where they lead to. Sort of psychology of why people do certain things has become interesting, especially in terms of JORC updates and ASIC thinking that self-regulation is not necessarily the best thing to do. All of Jacquie Coombs' stuff on competency, how that fits in, and then the ongoing, why do we keep on repeating the same mistakes that we repeat time and time and time again? There must be some sort of underlying error, brokenness, psychology of people. It just seems to repeat all the time. We don't seem to learn. You can go back 20 years and people are complaining about the same things. And then you go back another 20 years and it's the same things.
Yeah, yeah. That's a lot to wrestle with, man. I mean, is that outside a 40-hour work week, or is this sort of parallel too? Because you would almost say, do you have any hobbies? Because that's a lot of work to be wrestling with some pretty big topics. And these reporting codes, having been involved with it a little bit myself, once you get down those rabbit holes, you never leave, right? It's like Hotel California a bit. So it's, is there time in a week to do all of this?
I try and make time. It's the type of stuff I'm interested in. I enjoy reading.
Yeah.
So, I read a lot, and those are the type of things. And sometimes it's just, as I said, you go down a rabbit hole and then you find one interesting thing, and the next interesting thing leads to something else. And before you know it, in my case, I've got a pile of stuff to go and read through, and it just, patterns seem to emerge or don't.
Yeah.
And as I said, it's always just nice understanding where you came from. I mean, what most people don't, maybe gets the wrong expression, but UNFC's been around since 1979. The first JORC report, or first JORC committee report, was published in 1972, if I remember correctly, and CRIRSCO itself has been around for over a quarter of a century now.
Yeah. So why? But and maybe it's worth pursuing the reading thing, right? Because I remember. You run through an airport as you are on the way to somewhere, and for the first years of my career, you just pick up a book and you pick up another stupid Jack Reacher, just because you just want to have something mind-numbing to read and I've never really had any interest for what at the time I thought were all just self-help books or just like, people with opinions that wouldn't really matter for whatever reason, like completely biased from no reason at all, I guess. And then by pure chance, I got to read a book that somebody recommended about something professional in the workspace. And I thought, okay, I'm missing this entire world of people who have shit to say and smart things to say as well. And I'm actually beating myself up for not realizing further that there is so much knowledge out there and we're making the same mistakes and all the rest of it. And maybe then the question is it because people aren't reading enough anymore? Everybody has an opinion, right? Super easy to have an opinion on the internet, because you just read a post and a YouTube comment and now you're a specialist. And you just said, you read a lot, and I try to keep pace, but I can't, I'm just trying to not to doom scroll on a Friday night after a 50-hour work week, on YouTube Shorts, and my book is lying there, and I know I must read it, but the tussle between the book that is interesting and the YouTube Short, I think there is a real need for more reading on these kind of things, and it's almost like straight in the deep end on some of the things that I wanted to talk to you about. And for the listeners who are immediately confused by what the hell I'm talking about, you have these conversations a lot, and they have to be fueled by some sort of knowledge base that is not just your experience in the last 20 years. There has to actually be something more to it. And the stuff that you're writing, I'm really interested by it, and I actually had to copy a few things down to quote it out. From this recent article that you wrote for the South African journal, because there's an amazing paragraph in there that I think is really well written, talking about the critical drinker, right, in terms of linguistic. There's some really good stuff in there. So maybe after this sort of bizarre, loopy rant, reading, are you seeing that as well? Do you recommend or to younger people? Because I think you said the other day you talk to students in various places, and that's kind of what I'm saying. That just actually read something, just pick up a paper or a book or something. Is that part of the way out of this? Sorry, there's too much there, but I'm immediately into it.
Well, whenever I lecture, or as I say to the students, I'm going to be torturing you for 2 days or 45 minutes or whatever the time period is, I try and contextualize issues. Okay, so to throw in a literary reference, English chap called Malcolm Muggeridge, one of those literally literary giants who were there for a flash and vanish. But if you start digging into Britain in the 1930s and 1940s, he was, one of those people everybody read and everybody knew about. Interesting character, spy for MI5, went to Angola, not Angola, Mozambique during the Second World War, etc., etc. Anyway, he has quite an interesting book he wrote in the 1940s, looking back at the 1930s. And one of the things he mentions is that when you start looking at history in hindsight, it becomes simple. You see all the patterns and all the trends. It's very difficult to see the patterns and trends when you're looking forwards. Now, when I'm talking to people, and I guess it's a symptom of age and, crawling around uranium stopes when I was much younger, I've lived through a lot of this stuff, so it's history. For me, it was lived reality, and for them, it's history. And the way a lot of the times I think we as industry, we try and simplify because there's only limited times that you have someone that you're mentoring and training. And then it's almost the gods springing to life from Zeus's headache. Briex happened, and this happened, and they're all sort of these lumps of information without any context whatsoever. And it's almost in many ways it's like there's a rock in the stream, but what happened? Why did it occur? So to try and contextualize that, but then it's also trying to expand on the students and say, look, when you start going out there, the world is quite a complicated and messy place. It's not all these nice little things that slots into each other. You need to challenge yourself going out, and there are different opinions out there. Just because you don't agree, just because you get offended with those opinions, doesn't mean that they're not real. Eurocentric culture is very minor. People in general, a lot of the students I talk to, when you start talking about the history of Africa or the history of colonization, geopolitical trends, talking about critical raw materials, which everybody thinks that is, it's the first time that's happened. But if you say in 1919, platinum was a critical raw material and the American government wanted to ban it because you needed it in spark plugs and stuff, there's, I guess to a certain degree, like big eyes, because dare I say, the TikTok generation is very short term, and there's no necessarily contextualization with what's gone before and what are the trends and patterns that we're seeing, and what is it potentially going to result in tomorrow.
Well, that could by itself be, an hour of discussion, because I think what you're putting down there is, there is a certain element of l'histoire se répète in this, and we're not learning from history, which is obviously applicable to society at large, and the wars and whatever is going on out there that we can easily draw analogies to. But I think if I want to connect the dots then with, quality of work, reporting codes, regulation, making mistakes, all that sort of stuff, one of the things that I have been quite vocal about and deeply frustrated with is the lack of information out there. It happens, but it's only the distribution of what happened and why. And I kept calling it on this channel as well, airplane crash investigation, so that we learn from whatever the little bolt was that was loose, and we won't do that again. And we don't do that as an industry because we don't really go through that analysis and the broadcasting of mistakes that were made. And not necessarily an angle that I wanted to go too deep into, but if there's nothing to read, then there's nothing to learn. And the analysis of Briex are all out there, but there's far more beyond that world to understand why things are going wrong. I mean, there's a few other interesting things that have happened in the spotlight, even recently, as we just talked about the other day. But maybe then and I don't want to dip into this again, because I dip into this particular space quite frequently, and I wanted to provide a little, slightly different angle to this kind of aging regulation discussion, I guess. But is there, as we are struggling to work out what the problem is that we need to fix, is it just simply a matter of this self-regulation that you just briefly touched on a few minutes ago, the fact that we don't actually investigate anything, no repercussions, therefore no learnings, and nothing to read, to weave those things together. Is that why we are struggling so much as an industry? And then you are trying to put things down on paper, but then what I keep saying as well, nobody reads stuff anymore, because as you just say, we're in a TikTok place. So people want to just listen to 30. So this is already, 99% of the people have already left, because they're probably sitting in the car listening to the first 2 minutes, and they've already tuned out, right? Because it's difficult to have an hour of peace and actually listen to something technical about what it is that you're doing. So is that the kind of right tapestry, the weaving together of a bunch of different issues and problem? People don't read because we don't know what to read, particularly on this subject. And is there actually somebody who can put it down in the first place, who's got the qualifications, and who cannot be cancelled because they're saying something that is edgy? You got to give Roland Gothard some time in the sunlight, because for having the balls to actually say something. And I've mentioned it before on the channel. I'm not quite sure, if it's the right way to go, but to actually say something does create a learning environment for others. So again, lots of stuff to throw on the table here. But what do you think?
Well, I really enjoy reading Roland's stuff. I, again, don't necessarily always agree with him. It's one of those, I guess, wicked problems, because there's a whole, as you said, there's a whole load of things that are intertwined. Self-regulation. It's easy, or it's not that easy, I think, to necessarily always stand up, because people in and of themselves are flawed. So I would be the last one that's going to want to necessarily stand up and start criticizing somebody else, because I know there's enough other things where I haven't necessarily did the best work, whether it was due to pressure which we were all under to get something out within a time frame, whether it was in consulting or even back in industry. There's pressure, so the whole argument about agency theory, who's in control and who's going to pressurize you, human rights and privacy laws. It's all very well to say let's have a public hanging or public floggings, but then again, are you in pulling out a specific individual and making them the scapegoat for an industry-wide potential problem or weakness is also not necessarily the way to go. Canada is, to the best of my knowledge, is the only country that actually publishes naming lists, where people are dare I use the expression, named and shamed. No other countries do it. There's I guess there's always because industry is so small. You and I met 15 years ago. And and then someone will know somebody else, and then it's a case of do you want to be that guy?
Yeah, exactly.
So there's a whole load of other issues, and I just think it's not an easy solution. And the way that we've tried to, not we, but governments and regulators have tried to do it, there's legislation and regulation, but again, they come with their own problems. The classic case, to harp on about another book, the smartest men in the room, Enron. Enron was a classic case of people being hired because they knew the rules and regulations of GARP. And, that was the accountants know it's wrong, the lawyers know it's wrong, it's wrong, but as long as you define it in terms of what the requirements are, that's what it is. And, so you can go from, and what JORC tried to start off with, if you read the original 1972 report and some of the original documentation, is to appeal to the spirit of transparency and professionalism and good ethics. And then because there's obviously always people that try and see how far they can go, whether it's a junior trying to raise more money, whether it's someone who is just by default trying to commit fraud in the system, or whether it's because of short-termism that as a junior you need to consistently have a good story to tell. Things happen, and the way that the regulators do things is then they just put a whole lot of new law, or in Canada laws, or in Australia or South Africa or Britain's case, regulations in place, which you then need to start complying with. And then, as we all know, a lawyer is a lawyer, and they're the ones that can win a case because a comma is in a place which changes the meaning of the sentence, or as we were discussing previously, where you put that apostrophe can change things totally.
Yeah. No, I think this is the right tree to bark up, and I'll throw a sentence at you, and I've complained about this self-regulation thing forever and a day, right? I think it's the dumbest thing that we've ever come up with. So the question, maybe the most provocative way to ask it without pissing anybody off, would be, when they came up with JORC, or JORC, or that time of new regulation, whether it's the Canadians or Australia, whatever, did they ever consider or understand the rationalization trap principle? Right. That is a thing that I can't get myself across. And the more I talk to people who are fairly well informed on this channel about it, the more I believe that that's where the answers lie. And I think you know my position on this, but the cognitive dissonance problem is where it's at for me, because we talk about fraud, and then we analytically, as scientists who are in the physical world of data and so on, we step through this reasoning process, which is logical. It's based on data and information and steps and process workflows. But I think they're missing out on the fundamental problem that humans just cannot get across, is this rationalization trap. And for the listeners who don't know what I mean by that, and I'm just going to read this out because otherwise I'll stuff it up, and this is the devil is in the detail. The psychological phenomenon where the brain acts on emotion and subsequently invents a logical justification. And there's a whole bunch of people who've worked on this since the 50s, particularly this guy called Leon Festinger in 1957, who developed a theory of cognitive dissonance, and that's probably something that people heard before. People rationalize to reduce discomfort caused by inconsistent thoughts. And I think that's the kind of thing with these fraud cases as well, right? And these people who are kind of knowingly, but not knowingly, it's the discomfort that they know that they're doing something wrong. And I can bring up red pine or something again without actually knowing the full details. I'm not, don't shoot me for linking something that might have not the perfect example here, but I can imagine that somebody would have sat there and justified in their heads to make that discomfort, that cognitive dissonance go away by just doing this. And then you get one step in and a second step, and it's everywhere in the world. So again, my question, as they were putting JORC together in the 70s, I see a whole bunch of people around the table, probably blokes in the 70s, say, we've got this, we've nailed this. And they were smart people, right? But was there an appreciation? I mean, it's almost an impossible question to answer, I guess, the way I'm posing it to you. But, was there an appreciation of not just the scientific geological mining facts around this self-regulation? Because self-regulation, I think, I finally linked it to cognitive dissonance, because I've always just said, it's logical that it doesn't work, but I think I can explain why it doesn't work now, and it's because of that effect. Is that something you can do something with?
Well, I would probably say if Peter Stoker was here, he was there right back at the beginning. We should probably ask him.
Yeah. I will.
What little I can understand of the history of CRIRSCO, and speaking to the few surviving people, because a lot of them have now passed on, a big part of the rationale, and again, this is one of the things that people tend to forget or gets wiped out in history, there were other reporting codes and standards around. America had the McKelvey box. South Africa did have a standard. Various companies had adopted various other standards. Whether they were consistent or not was neither here nor there. Obviously, the Soviet system was in place. But my understanding, a lot of the stuff was to really try, and again, people forget, globalization was a big thing. It was the middle of the Cold War. You wanted secure supply chains. And it was a case of the then large companies and investors all wanted to be able to speak the same language. And that, to the best of my understanding, was part of the reason why the pre-CRIRSCO group was formed, was more consistent communication and standardization of language. Then pre-BRIEX, there was the whole Voisey's Bay bubble, which ended up being something of value. And the book, the Voisey's Bay Hustle, is again a fantastic and interesting read. And that sort of then ties into sort of relatively free-for-all regulation in the Canadian Stock Exchange, because as everybody's making money, no one cares. So yes, there is this cognitive dissonance. We're making money, everybody's happy. Therefore, why go and ask any nasty questions? Let's don't rock the boat. Everybody's becoming millionaires overnight. And then obviously BRIEX happens, and the whole edifice comes crashing down, and then people start having deeper thoughts. And it's the same thing if you actually go back to the Ray Commission reports, which again is freely available on the internet. And again, for my sins, I've read it, and it's actually a fascinating read. It wasn't, again, the oversimplification that people seem to think it is. Something happened. There was a whole context where people were making money, and so the stock markets decided they just overlook a dodgy deal or two, or overlooked the fact that the people that found Windaro actually had created the company, I think, a week beforehand, before they announced the results. And then people, I think it was in the Sydney or the Melbourne Stock Exchange, I can't remember exactly, but they were getting shares, and there's a whole lot of insider trading, and you could go down to the pub and the local barman was the guy that was giving inside information because he was getting it from the drillers, type of thing. So I think there was an acknowledgement of that, but if you start reading through it, a lot of it was, and again, this is where Peter Stoker and Jean-Michel Randu and the few other people that are still around, and reading through the original minutes, it was really more to try and have a common language, so there was no miscommunication, so there was consistency between what, if we're talking about measured, theoretically we both have the same concept in mind. Okay, we don't always come up with the same answers when we're talking about measured, but it was common language. So if you say basalt, you understand basalt, I understand basalt.
No, well, that's exactly the point that I'm trying to make. It was more about, indeed, the technical aspects of alignment of language and going through an analysis of, what went wrong, and therefore coming up with this common platform. But I guess to ask the question in a more specific way, because I guess I'm not asking, what were the guys thinking? What do you think the guys were thinking at that time? It's almost like a rhetorical question. It seems to me obvious that indeed they were very much into the space of problem solving in a very analytical way, not giving too much time and space to the rationalization trap. Because if you look at self-regulation as a principle, you can only come to the conclusion, or at least in my head for the thinking that I've done on it, that it was ill-considered from that perspective. Psychology was not included in the maybe people talked about it and thought about it, but I think in the paperwork that we have today, and incidentally, the whole reason why we want to now change JORC, and I've made this point ad nauseum, is that some people are clearly still not playing by the rules. And we think we can fix that with more deeper clauses and more text and more regulation. But the problem that you're trying to fix is the 5 people who are trapped in a rationalization trap, and more regulation isn't going to fix that, right? Is that maybe, I'm trying to make quite a deliberate point here, that I think, where we also weave in some of what's currently happening and the delays in JORC and why that is, and what problem we're actually trying to fix. And as many people will probably agree with, either intuitively or otherwise, is that, we're oversteering the ship, and I'm also getting worried that we're trapped in this overregulation space. And don't get me wrong, I'm obviously a fundamental supporter, because the pharma principle of a fair market, I can explain with a really nice analogy, to make sure that we all go the right fork in the road when we have to decide, do we want regulation or no regulation? Clearly, we need regulation. But we need regulation with an appreciation of the psychological effects that that trip people over, and those cannot be regulated by a couple of clauses.
I fully agree. I would probably, and again, this is speaking from a massive point of ignorance. I mean, I don't know what they were thinking in 1972 and, in 2001. As I said, I can get hold of, the people that were there. But I really think, you've got a group of geologists and mining engineers talking science. They weren't psychologists or sociologists at all. And I don't think that was the foundation. You have someone like Harry Parker, who was very pragmatic. So I honestly don't think that even conceptualized that. And if you start thinking about it, a lot of the research done by people like, was it Bent Flyberg?
Yeah, Flyberg. I actually have the book accidentally on the table here for
that type podcast. That type of thing, and the chap that wrote Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow. I mean, a lot of that thought process is relatively recent, and it doesn't tend to cross over into geology because we're scientists. We look at science. That's fuzzy stuff.
So this is exactly the point where I wanted to get, and sorry it took me 32 minutes to get there. So the question is, should we make that book, because I think that is a starting point where that should be mandatory reading for anybody touching JORC. Sorry, I'm just going to be an asshole and say it. I think Thinking Fast and Slow should be mandatory reading for anybody that tries to play with something like that at that level of making changes. You have to, and I'm not claiming that I've read everything, but I'm starting to see a universe where it's a holy shit moment for me. Like and even because I know you wrote some stuff about the Parker Challenge with the resource estimation and so on. I actually, and I said this before, I tried to, when I read the book first, get Kahneman to the conference, the resource estimation conference, to have a keynote on that, because I think as resource geologists, we get absolutely caught in these traps, the cognitive biases trap. Holy shit, that's where I think, I get it now. I don't have to be as nervous as a resource geologist more. Just having the comfort of understanding what goes on in my own brain and why I'm making certain decisions in the wrong way. I think it's great. Unfortunately, he has passed on as well. So but there must be others in that space that we can overlap with. And dare I say it again, the way out of these fairly frustrating conversations that we seem to have at these conferences. We had a number of panels at the conference, and they were okay, but they left me just wanting for lack of a better term, for more depth in that space. I'm just super curious in that space, and we need to bring others from other industries in to look at what we are doing and go, well, guys, come on, this is obvious because of this and that. And I think this space that the Kahnemans of the world occupy have tremendous value to offer to how we approach these things. Fraud, code, regulation, resource estimation, reporting of results, the cognitive biases that happen when you classify something. I know you care about classification as well. Should we just make that book mandatory reading for every undergraduate? Because I know you teach, right, at the university, or you lecture there. I reckon that should be mandatory reading. Is that something? Am I on the wrong track here? Is this a good thing to pursue, or am I just getting overly excited about something that isn't going to move the needle?
I can't necessarily say that a specific text should be prescribed. I think there's a lot of work we make. I believe a lot of the times you make assumptions that, and this is one of the areas where there's probably going to be a little bit controversial. A lot of the times seems to be a default position that a scientist is intrinsically honest and will follow the science. And that's separated from the person who is, comes with baggage and emotions, and, Friday is, wants to get out, and Monday morning is, if you've partaken or participated a little bit too heavily over the weekend, you're not necessarily the best at your job. And a lot of the times I think we pretend to live in a very idealized world. So I think there's a lot of focus on, or there should be a lot more focus on ethics and stuff. We assume that people behave ethically, but is that correct? We live in nowadays, it's very much a relative morality is a relative philosophy. So everything is relative to something else. So you're making the assumption that people have grown up with potentially in a Islamic or a Judeo-Christian, there's right and wrong, not shades of gray. I think we tend to forget that. So to try and get to the point, I think there's a lot to be said for having at least compulsory ethics lecturing, business ethics, geoscience ethics. I know there's a growing trend towards it, but it, again, is one of the many other things I get up to in my limited spare time. So in the Geological Society of London, to get effectively your charter to become a competent person and to take responsibility for signing off on mineral reserves and mineral resources, your Australian ore reserves, you go through an interview process. And one of the things which is on the Geological Society of London's list is, have you read the Code of Conduct and Ethics? And it's quite interesting when you start getting so most of the people I've interviewed or been part of the interview panel are pretty up there on the technical stuff. They can answer the technical stuff, they know the job, we can have discussions about classification and use creek variance and slope of regression and all the nice fancy stuff that we like to talk about. When you start getting into the ethics side, that tends to be a bit harder, not only for the person you're interviewing, but also for someone like me. How do you phrase that question? How do you actually ask something which is, what is an ethical dilemma? And a lot of the times when we start asking ethical questions or get into ethical dilemmas, in all the codes, there's the client or whoever is not allowed to put undue pressure on the competent person and sign off. Great in principle. But when you are a employee and that's your job and you've got a mortgage to pay and you've got to put food on the table and stuff, these questions aren't as easy as when you're sitting around a table and everybody's thinking about what is the nice moral thing to do. When it becomes that decision, do you put food on the table next month or not, I think some of these questions actually become a lot harder to answer, but we don't always tend to want to tackle them.
Well, okay. Why not? And who's we?
Well, we would be, I would argue, the whole scientific community, because again, it gets back to the whole, as soon as people in glass houses don't throw stones, and if you start pulling one, it gets, I suspect it starts, and now I'm speculating on psychology, and I'm not a psychologist, so maybe you should actually have a psychologist in, and maybe Jacquie Coombs in discussing this in a lot more detail with people who are knowledgeable about the subject. But it's a type of thing like a social fabric or any social structure. You start pulling one thread, and when you pull the wrong thread or the right thread, everything starts falling apart. And maybe there's a visceral fear that if we start pulling those threads, all our structures that we've created, you're going to be the emperor. We as a general, or you as a general, are going to be the emperor with no clothes.
No, that's spot on. I reckon that's really well phrased as well. And I think, and it's not for me, it's not for you, because like you just said, we're not psychologists. And just because you read a book, you don't suddenly know everything about it either, right? So, but I do always feel like kind of the feeling of somebody's got to do something in this space is something that I come back to, because we have people in the industry that I think that think about this and read about this but we haven't really tapped into that huge discipline of psychology that might have actually some of the answers. And maybe just as an idea, the AusMM is putting courses together, and it's all technical, how to finance a project, the JORC Code, a bunch of other courses, and they're great. Maybe this is actually a topic, right? Maybe there's I mean, geez, at university, we had in Amsterdam the history of science, right? And we hired a dude from another department who wasn't a geologist. And you know, we talked about Rene Descartes and all those people and to actually understand how, and that was, you know, I thought at the time, geez, what a bunch of nonsense, you know, but later you think, well, that's interesting. And maybe these kind of courses is something that we do need to weave into. It's actually great that you ask these questions and have that already embedded in your interview process, because that's not something that we in Australia do, even though I'm sitting in New Zealand, obviously. And maybe there's something to say for introducing a component of that in not only our interviews, but also our competent person testing and thresholds and information that we share. You know, like I wasn't advocating for one single resource, but these are 5 books that you could read to familiarize yourself with the ethics and the morality and the principles of making decisions and those things that you were just putting down. And I think that might actually be a really interesting angle to pursue, because and not that you'd suddenly, you know, again, you still probably have the same 5% of people who still make the same 5%, same decisions on those exploration results and so on. But at least I think you might be changing the focus away from this overregulation, because that's where all these LinkedIn discussions descend into, you know, is this overregulation space. So yeah, I'm actually quite you know, excited, dare I use the word again, to see if this can add some value to what we do as professionals. So maybe we can beat this dead horse further, but yeah, I might pick another lineup with you separately on this. I think it's I mean, even in the resource that you're working on, right, for the industry, that'd be a great section, right? The book, or the series of books, you know, that'd be a great section just on the psychology of this. And yeah, I'm at the resource conference. Maybe for the next one, there might be a topic on this to weave into this as well. Maybe just to change course slightly, and I'm just gonna.
Before you go, I've got to throw in another literary reference.
Oh,
so you want to have a junior officers reading club type of books?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Okay. The Junior Officers Reading Club is quite a famous biography written about the junior British officer in Afghanistan and the books that they read to educate themselves. That's all.
Yeah. Okay. I'm not familiar with that. I mean, the name rings a bell, but that's a good one. I will put it in as well. I am gonna just quote yourself here, sure. and on this. On what you were writing, I think a few months ago already here. To understand why some of these practices have developed, we need to delve into the psychology and environments of both the CP and the investor. What drives them? Do the rules drive CPs to become Lotophages? That's a word I had to look up. Applying standardized process flows and methodologies like Cravelet's robots, because that's how we do things around here, quote unquote. Question mark. Are investors mere mini-me caricatures of Gordon Gekko driven by the mantra that greed, for lack of a better word, is good? Has 25 years of CRIRSCO codes and JSC regulation resulted in CPs who are conservative, striving for defensible, auditable work that will win the golden squirrel, and in so doing stifling innovation and eroding both value and worth? I mean, wow, you know, I don't know what that's beautifully written and on point. How long does that take you to write that paragraph? Because you must have come back to that a number of times. I don't know, we just had another sideline discussion about, you know, how we write, but that is really well written. So what was the angle with that paper and you know, and thanks for all the references, but yeah, which are funny. But yeah, can you maybe elaborate on what you're trying to do with that paper?
Well, part of it in South Africa, like in Australia, there's a lot of people, rightly or wrongly, who believe that there's a trend towards overregulation.
Yeah.
You know, and instead of alluding back to the competent person or the consultant or whatever brand you're going to put on them, tends to default back to the rules. And they turn the geological brain off when it gets into something which may be a little bit out of the ordinary. And then, okay, that's what the rules say. That's what we're sticking to, because at the same, I guess it's one of these things to contextualize. So in South Africa, the very first version of SAMREC, the South African Reporting Code, was in 2000. What behavior was then driven, or the behavior that happened, was a lot of the larger mining companies got into this my resource is bigger than your resource mentality. And a lot of them, because the ultra deep Witwatersrand gold mines or platinum mines, the companies were putting in resources below infrastructure. So the RPEEE criterion was violated, but there was actually no RPEEE criterion specifically at that stage. Then what happened with the 2004 update, and there was a few other things that happened in South Africa, which I won't get into. Readers or listeners who are interested, please go and research that time in South African mining history. But it was precipitated by hostile takeover between two companies, and there's a whole lot of things that came out came out of that. Plus, also at the same time, or very close proximity to that, you had Enron happening as well. So there's a whole reiteration and looking back and trying to tighten up on rules and guidelines. So things like what is a measured resource, what's the tighter definitions for measured, indicated, and inferred. A mineral reserve could only be quoted if it was economically viable. At that stage, there was a loophole. There was no strict definition of but economic viability. Mm-hmm. But what then happened is all the companies then had to restate the mineral resources. Now, some of them did it overnight and others did it gradually, but they all ended up having to take massive valuation write-downs because obviously you don't have that resource anymore, because what was, say, potentially inferred or indicated now had to be written off because it just wasn't a resource and under the new definitions. I think that precipitated across not the companies, but most companies and practitioners, this a more conservative approach, because obviously, as it stated in that article, pretty much it was the competent persons were all blamed. Why did you allow this to happen? And that's alluding to agency theory. You're now working in a company and the boss has said, this is what we've got because the boss has went out to the press. And, there's a whole load of stuff in the press, and it's like, we've got this project, it's 20 million tons at, 5 grams per ton, and that's what's out in the public domain. And now you as a competent person now need to sort of try and find those tons and, find a way to get that stuff because that's what the boss has already said. So I think it precipitated a lot of that. And in South Africa, there's a trophy known as the Golden Squirrel Award, which is awarded annually to the best report on the JSE. That's a Golden Squirrel reference. If you're South African, you get it.
Yeah.
So, and, that's transparency and stuff. So, it's easier if you get a consultant and that's doing your audit. The easiest way to get through an audit, as we all know, is you don't deviate beyond the norm. And if you don't deviate beyond the norm, then you get all the ticks because, you're not the tall poppy. You're not going to be questioned. You give a single number. You don't give a range of probabilities. You don't do probabilistic modeling, because as soon as you do any of those things which are beyond the standard practice the industry accepts, then people start asking questions. Mm-hmm. And, it also rolls on to, if you're a shareholder, you like to see a number. I think I alluded in the article, measured's good, and measured and indicated is good, inferred's bad. So you want to see more and more measured and indicated. Mm-hmm. So again, there's pressure to try and, get as much measured into the project. Any financial institution, when they're looking at lending you money, they look at your M&Is.
Yeah. Yeah.
So again, there's all those pressures coming in. And then obviously if you're most investors, or I can't say most, but investors per se, again, they're looking for something where they're going to get a return on the money. So again, they're going to be looking at, this company's got a lot of measured and indicated and it's all at high grade. Mm-hmm. So again, there's the drive towards that, and there's from an investor's point of view, you obviously want to return on your capital.
Yeah.
So, and that's where the whole Gordon Gekko reference, greed is good.
Yeah.
As Matt Mullins from Snowden Optiro told me, we were having a discussion about this, and he said, Mark, the thing that everybody forgets, and I was forgetting, is during the bubble time, like the IT bubbles and stuff, when the share prices are going up, no one complains.
Yeah.
Everybody's happy. No one questions the system because everybody's making money.
Yeah.
It's only when the bubble bursts or things fall apart and you start losing money that people start screaming. I think Matt's expression was, in a roller coaster, you never hear people screaming as they're going up. You only hear the screams when they go down.
Yeah. So that then leads to the question: Are we trying to fix something that shouldn't need fixing? Because we go up, we go down, people freak out anyway. People lose money, people win money. I mean, isn't that just part and parcel of the industry life and investing and risk and everything? Is there a place to? Because I guess the one of the problems, and I call this out frequently on the channel as well, that we get accused as consultants to make our own beds here by constantly fiddling with the codes, to be able to secure the next 20 years of charging our clients for new changes and so on, right? Is there a real need for change? I mean, it's a loaded question, but do you see, from the experience that you have across continents, jurisdictions, CRIRSCO had South African experience, do you see, and I appreciate that you might not either want or can completely answer the question, but do you see the current drive for change? Because there are people talking about, putting pressure on resource classification yet again, indicated and further measure. We need to tinker with it, we need to change it. Do you feel we need to continue to change with it, or what's there is working and it just needs to be better explained?
Well, I think that there's actually two parts to the question. My experience, and again, it's only my perception, is the regulatory issues are driven by the stock markets, because again, the stock markets don't want unhappy investors. So when things go wrong, then obviously the investors go to the stock markets react by, but guys, you're self-regulating. Why has this happened again? What are you doing about it? Professional organization, you've certified these people, why are we seeing the same disaster again? And therefore their reaction, because again, a lot of them are accountants and lawyers, so they regulate.
Right.
And my understanding, reading some of the ASIC stuff with JORC, a lot of it was driven by ASIC wanting more regulation because they were getting tired of seeing consistently the same issues happening and companies defaulting and people losing money in Australia.
Yeah.
And similar across in other jurisdictions. But ASIC seems to have been the most vocal about the whole thing. In terms of the definitions, I'm still in two minds about them. And I think I've made another bizarre reference in that article that you're referring to about Russian nesting dolls. I always forget the Russian name. I always have to go.
The dolls. Yeah.
It's a very nice, on the face of it, it's a nice simple system, and everything slots into it. But we know geology is messy. I personally think to a certain degree we've done a disservice, and it's Harry Parker's, something Harry Parker had talked about a lot. But there's geological uncertainty and risk, and there's great uncertainty and risk. And I think over time we've conflated them. And I think to a certain degree, because it's easier as soon as you've got assay data, you shove it into a software program and you can do a semi-variogram and you can run numbers. But that whole nasty, the continuity of your quartz vein and how sheared it is and the angle of dip and the pinch and swell, it tends to be a little bit harder to try and quantify that.
Well, so, and at risk of opening that Pandora's box, I had exactly that chat on the channel. This is a year ago now, but there was somebody advocating quite strongly for the the quantification or the uncertainty that we get out of the grades uncertainty, which we have processes for and have been well understood for a long time, for that to drive the classification. I'm probably paraphrasing slightly incorrectly, but that's what I took out of it. And indeed, my counter argument was, well, you still need to then include geological uncertainty. You can't just do all this binary or this quantitative wizardry, and then still have your subjective finger strike across and divvy things up based on your impression of the geology. And there's been a lot of papers and people talking about the quantification of geological uncertainty, particularly in the last few years, and we can see those papers coming through at the conference. But I'm not really seeing full-blown systems to integrate that on par with the quantification of grade uncertainty and all the rest of it. So I'm not quite sure why that discussion doesn't seem to want to go away, because that's a wicked problem, especially if you are then also right at the end trying to shoehorn all of this complexity in 3 words that are quite, from a non-native English speaker perspective, quite funny words as well, in terms of inferred, indicated, and measured. I'm just fascinated by the linguistics there. So I think, maybe not to extend this one too far, but so who or where do you see this going? What's your ideal world around the classification discussion? Should we, discussion is always good, I guess, right? So we should be talking about it, and discourse and conferences and papers is always good. But, are we, again, beating a dead horse here, or is there a genuine area for improvement ahead of us? And does it just need the right people and the right timing and the right events to happen for that to go somewhere? What do you think?
I think it's always worthwhile to go back and just reinterrogate assumptions, because to try and get out of that is the way it's always been done here trap. There's a lot better people based, a lot better than me, that Marcello Godoy from Anglo Gold Ashanti. He's been doing a lot of that type of stuff. Edson Ribeiro, Clayton, Mo, Isabel Clark, they're probably a lot better placed than that. I just think it's, it gets back to another discussion we were having. There's now so many things that a young geologist, to use a geologist, is expected to know, and then you're dumping other stuff on top of them. So I suspect we're probably getting to the stage where people get to know a lot of stuff, but not in depth. Now, how do you do that? Jacquie in a PhD has a thesis, at least in terms of resource geology. But then, as you've alluded to, you start getting back into wicked problems, because, gone are the days, in most cases, of the large mining houses, or if they do exist, they tend not to have all those dedicated and detailed programs. I know when I graduated, to be a senior geologist, the company that I was working for was, they didn't even, don't even ask about it unless you had minimum of 5 years experience. Then maybe you could have those discussions. To become, in South African terminology, assistant chief geologist, which I think you call a geological superintendent in Australia, you had to be in your mid-30s.
Yeah.
And there was normally, most companies had a whole lot of training courses that you had to go through and successfully complete. Mm-hmm. Nowadays, from what I can see, I've had students, I walk in and, they're sitting as a chief geologist 10 years later on, and, it's like, okay, you're chief geologist, but, the depth of knowledge is not necessarily there. And I know that's, beginning to sound like, grumpy old, Muppet sitting, in the top balcony type of thing, grumping and throwing things. But, again, a lot of these things sound easy, but when you start digging into them, they're not as simple. There's generally no easy solutions. And I think a lot of it's compounded, and it's one of those many elephants in the room. Everybody's talking about critical raw materials and strategic raw materials and how we're going to extract them and how we're going to refine them. But at the same time, use Australia as an example. Over time, you start, this university shut down its geology department, that university shut down its mining engineering department. So the West, or the world in general, wants to go carbon neutral, but at the same time, there's this, again, massive dissonance between what we want to do and then the people that are going to theoretically be driving it and the people that need the skills to go and drive that in a to use some buzzwords, ethical and sustainable manner.
Yeah, so that's interesting, and I at risk of diving down a new rabbit hole again, I think the agents of change that are out there, because I talked on the channel a lot to people with great experience and great ideas and just such deep thinking about some of these issues. But if you go back to go back all the way to the start and go back to history, the people who've made changes to these industries, they were the weirdos and the outcasts and the people who would be cancelled in 3.5 seconds if they would try to do the same thing today, and who were cancelled, right? I mean, the earth is flat, right? To the burn pile you shall go, right? And you drum up my familiar names again here, and again, and this is not about Roland or anything, but as an example of people who are prepared to indeed put themselves out there, because like you said, you have a job, you work for a consultancy, they need to check this video to say if you're not saying anything that they don't like, and you do work with CRIRSCO, and they probably want to know what you're putting out there as well. You're not going to say anything wild that puts the world upside down, right? But and for that reason, if you're not on a TikTok video with a juggling bear and have hula hoop dancers in the background, your voice will not be heard in this world. So you're putting a strong argument as agents for change. And I'm struggling with that concept as well, right? I mean, I'm trying to put videos out with interesting conversations, but to be quite honest, they turn into fucking boring chat sometimes because, people want fireworks, right? They don't want to sit and listen to, two guys chatting about overregulation. So I'm always playing with the thought. I know this is just a genuine, whether we air this or not is another matter. I'm just on a rant here, right? But I'm just thinking, so sometimes I want to try and play the, you want to be somewhat edgy to kind of have people on a hook, like, okay, I want to listen to this, it's exciting. Maybe they're going to say something new for a change, and after 10 minutes you go, it's the same bullshit again, of a couple of people ranting, the balcony, the Muppets reference, love it, So do we actually then need to somehow support the Rolands of the world? And there are a few others out there, and I can go through names, but that's not really the purpose of this. But you know what I mean, because it's the Galileos of the world, that go out there and they say stuff in a wild and weird manner that then actually change the world. Am I that person? Are you that person? Do you see people in our industry that are doing that we should actually support rather than ostracize? Because I'm not commenting on any of the posts, right? And I should. I have something to say about everything he's putting down. As you say, most of it I fully agree with, but some stuff I don't, and it's not good for my brand, for my person, to be, it could be cancelled overnight if I say the wrong thing, and it's not in my best interest. But then, now I'm a hypocrite because now I'm actually not actually calling things out that I should be calling out. I'm struggling with those issues, and as you want to be an agent for change, you're going to put a shitload of time in this book with lots of references that some people have to buy, and the 200 professionals that already know this shit will probably buy it, but nothing will change, right? I mean, this is a nihilistic view of the world now that I'm placing, but what do we do, man? Who are the people that are dragging us through here and are prepared to put the juggling hat on and the Joker face to really incite change? Pass.
No, it's something I've like you, I've thought about it, and I acknowledge my own hypocrisy is one way of doing it. But again, it gets back to what you've alluded to. You can stand out there and you can, jump up and down like Galileo, or the guy that invented plate tectonics, whose name I've promptly forgotten.
That guy.
Or Philip Kerr, who discovered Cartier, and everybody thought he was certifiably insane because there's no diamonds in America. But as you say, as I've alluded to, it's a small industry. If you want to put food on the table, you don't want to be branded as that person. Do you try and affect the change within the system? Does it always work? Or do you? I guess it gets to the stage that once a system is entrenched, for example, CRIRSCO, and I'm not knocking CRIRSCO. CRIRSCO started off with 5 member states. It's now reached 16 officially. 17 will be by the end of the month. Probably be by the end of the year or early next year will be 20 member states. CRIRSCO effectively has achieved hegemony over reporting standards. The CRIRSCO system is now entrenched. How do you affect that change? I mean, you can, like some people are standing on the outside of the, jumping up and down and throwing things. And while some of the arguments are rational, it's the way that you necessarily, I think, try and approach, because it gets, and then I guess this is where it starts getting to psychology, which is now straying well beyond my remit. But I guess you could argue it's like a young child. They've got something to say, they don't know quite how to phrase it, they're talking to the adult dismisses them. They then get frustrated because there's something really important that they're trying to communicate. So the only way that they understand how to do it is to start getting more vocal and upset and screaming, which then causes the adults, in this case I'm using the CRIRSCO analogy, to sort of step back and sort of say, well, just go into the corner and calm down, and when you can behave like an adult, we'll talk to you. And both sides, I think, are missing the point. Again, which is why I think, and it's very difficult in any organization to try and affect change. I mean, you start looking at, again, let's use politics. Once a political system is entrenched and established, there's vested interests, and they're not going to move or do something unless there's an external force of such a magnitude that will change things. So, once, and again, using CRIRSCO is there, CRIRSCO is established. It's a system that, for all its strengths and weaknesses, seems to work relatively well. On the face of things, they have, the application of CRIRSCO has improved reporting standards overall. Countries that join CRIRSCO, a lot of them do it because it gives the country I'm trying to use language here which is not going to sound weird and wonderful, but they're shown that they've got regulation in minerals, resource, and so they're using a system which is known, a system which is recognized, and it gives, I guess, investors for direct foreign investment or capital going into countries where they wouldn't necessarily have invested in. Oh, you're now a member of CRIRSCO, you are effectively a safe haven, you've got professional bodies established, you've got a disciplinary code of conduct. Therefore, that country now becomes a lot more attractive to invest in. So how are you going to change that system? Because the system by and large has, is seen as being a positive system, even though there's issues that other juniors are not happy about. How do you change that? Well, I would imagine it's going to take something, a black swan event, to throw in another literary reference, to fundamentally change things. So you would need to have another massive scandal where CRIRSCO has to go back and re-examine everything from first principles.
That's I'm playing with the thought to go deeper, but I think my brain is fried with the many references, good references. I'm very appreciative of that, but there's going to be a lot of homework putting those on the screen, because I always want people to be able to find those later on. But Mark, I'm drained, even though I have this masochistic want for more and a bit of a self-lashing on this topic. That might have to happen offline or at a conference somewhere, or for another day, depending on where we both feel we could do more. But any parting thoughts for today? Because otherwise, I think it's a good time to put a full stop behind the sentence for now and let it rest for a little bit. But anything else on your mind?
Yeah, is Artemis 2 going to be able to achieve launch today, or they're going to cancel it?
Well, that has to be. That depends on when this comes out and how long in the future people will listen to this and wonder what the hell we're talking about. So, yeah, who knows?
No,
right?
seriously, yeah. Oh no, not at the moment. The follow-up conversations always great, and I enjoy our chats, and even though we don't necessarily always, I wouldn't say we don't always agree. Sometimes it's just understanding the language that the other person is using and trying to come to a common understanding and ground. I think, like everything, I will go back to it. I think if you change your premise that people are people, and because people are people, all these weird, wonderful things are going to happen, then when fraud or something goes wrong, it shouldn't actually be a shock. I think it's only a shock because people make the assumption that, we're scientists and engineers, and we're going to be robots, and we're going to follow the rules and stuff. And then when something goes wrong, it's like, but he was such a nice guy. He was a geologist, or he was a mining engineer, or sorry, she was a mining engineer.
Yeah.
The interesting thing, before I go, the last point, if you go and start looking at fraud in the mining industry, the vast majority being committed by geologists, and all of the ones that I've been able to track down have all been committed by males. So is that something else that we should be looking at and having males cannot be CEOs of a company, and they definitely can't be geologists in charge of a junior company, or not?
Well, look, I think that's a great thing to leave on, but that brings me to another book reference just to humor you. When I was a child, there was a Dutch book by Thea Beckman, and she writes books, just children books, but it's a world ruled by women. And I was fascinated by that, and I've long held, if we want fewer wars and more agreement, we should probably put different people in charge. And I think intuitively, I understand why that trend is there. So yeah, it's that's perhaps something to look into further. And yeah, we need data, but we'll probably see some familiar trends there. Look, on the fraud thing, I think that let's take that offline for a little bit more bashing, because I think that by itself could be a good standalone topic. But yeah, and I apologize for the, like you said it very well. I have to give it to you, because I spiral in these. I know where I'm trying to go, and then I'm trying to weave stuff into it, but 5 minutes later I hear myself ranting, and I go, the other person has no fucking idea what I'm on about, so, and then I have to try and come up with a question that actually means something that I've already forgotten what I said 2 minutes ago. So apologies for that. I know I do that, but can't help myself. But yeah, no, nice to chat. Great subject. I can, like you, talk for hours about this. So thanks very much. Thanks for making the time in your evening. I know we're on time zones 12 hours apart. And let's keep chatting. Thanks, Mark.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, and have a great day. And I will see if Artemis actually launches.
We'll keep in touch on that. Yeah. Thanks, man. See you later.
Okay. See ya.